Hydrangea flower is one of the more complicated botanicals to paint, but also very satisfying when you see the final result. So in this video, I will show you how I created this hydrangea watercolor step by step, and I will give you a few tips on how to think about this flower and how to organize your layers of color to achieve a realistic result. This video was inspired by one of my followers who commented, "I wish my brain worked like that," which I thought was so interesting because it can be tricky to explain how my mind works when I'm painting, but there are definitely some underlying principles that I've followed here, and I'm happy to share them, so thank you for challenging me to organize my thoughts. As always, all materials are listed in the video description below, and you can also download my reference photo there as well, so you can practice along with me. The entire process took about 4.5 hours, but I stretched it out over a period of 5 days because I wanted my layers to be thoroughly dry. So the most important thing to remember when approaching this botanical subject, this hydrangea, is that it's actually a cluster of flowers that you need to be able to imagine as a sort of a solid shape, usually a sphere, and treat your shadows and highlights not according to the shape of individual flowers, but rather according to the overall shape of the cluster of flowers. So depending on how light hits the subject, you will have some smaller flowers that are more illuminated and others that are more in the dark. Of course, there are some variations within each flower, but we need to keep this general principle in mind in order to achieve a realistic result. It's okay to paint your smaller 4-leaf flowers one by one, as I actually did in this painting, but be mindful of the overall tone and where your big cluster of flowers is mostly illuminated by the light and where the smaller flowers are primarily in the shadow. You will actually see me lose track of this where I left too many of these lower left flowers too light and had to cover them several times with blue wash to make them sort of fade into the background. That's okay, mistakes happen, especially with watercolors, and these were relatively easy to fix because they were quite light. Of course, it would be difficult to fix if I went too dark. But let's get back to the beginning. I picked this multicolored blue, green, red hydrangea, and the first thing I did was I established my lighter colors, which is a typical process I would follow with any flower. What was unusual was that the lighter colors were mostly featuring cold yellows and greenish blues, so I used a lot of lemon yellow and spring green from Daniel Smith. And then I stopped and switched to the darker color, and this is not my typical process, so I typically build my saturation slowly, but here it was necessary to switch to the darker color immediately after the lightest color because I wanted a reference point for my midtones. So I did a quick wash of aqua blue and spring green here on the corner just to give me a good idea of how dark I wanted to go on the flowers. My plan here is to have a really dark, moody background with cold blues and greens, which will make my hydrangea flower sort of pop. And this is my tip number 2 for painting hydrangeas. Establish your lightest and darkest values quickly and build your midtones from there. They're sort of your boundaries, which you can reference every time you're painting each individual petal. And you want to stay within these boundaries or move them slowly, like you will see me do in a few minutes when I add more and more saturation to my background, allowing me to add more dark pigments to the petals. So then I went back and continued to work on my flowers, building saturation slowly and introducing more and more purples and violets, mostly on the edges of each petal, keeping the center of each small flower light and full of sort of greens and cold yellows. This is not a typical hydrangea flower that features more or less one color throughout with some supporting hues depending on the light. I painted those many times before and I wanted something more challenging that would allow me to really get into the details. Which brings me to tip number 3. No matter what your color scheme is, find your shadows within the cluster. And in other words, the shadows that individual petals are casting onto other petals. These shadows are very important as they will help you create a sense of depth and realism. So what you want to avoid is simply outlining each petal and not considering how it interacts with light and what effect it has on surrounding petals. Now I wanted to finish the background layer, and this is my general tip when painting the background elements. Keep your palette on a cooler side, because visually we perceive cooler colors like blues and cold greens, cooler red, as being further away, and I always stress this in my lessons. You can find a lot of my in-depth lessons on Skillshare, but essentially what your eye will perceive as being further in the distance has to be a little bit colder in terms of the color spectrum. And I did keep a few lemon yellow spots here and there just to help me kind of tie it all together, because I used a lot of lemon yellow on the flowers themselves. Another color that helped me keep it all kind of consistent and cohesive was purple, and I used my favorite dioxazine purple both on the background layer and on the flower layers. And if you want to know more about this color and some of my other go-to favorite watercolors, you can check out a video where I describe my top 10 favorite pigments. So that's another general tip. Keep your palette cohesive, and if you introduce a color on in one spot of your painting, then find an opportunity to also have it in other layers and other planes, and it will help you kind of keep the overall composition harmonious. Now I also used salt, wet on wet, the silk salt, just to add a little bit of variation in terms of the texture of my background. I wanted it to be a little bit different from the flower itself, and so I dropped just a few pieces of salt, and it created a couple of interesting effects. Tip number 4, your hydrangea flower has details, lots of them, and those thin veins in each petal and these little sphere-shaped details in the center of each small flower, they require some attention, and you may be tempted to paint them all with same intensity and with the same level of detail, but the key here is to focus on the ones that are closer to you. So it's really more about the way our eyes work when we're looking at a three-dimensional subject, and our goal here is to recreate this three-dimensional effect on a two-dimensional plane. So what you will see me do is work with my smaller brush, my finer brush, to really add a lot more detail on the small flowers that are closer to me, and I really avoided putting in too much detail on the flowers that are further away. I basically focused on all these details at the front and skipped the details on the flowers that are in the back. And for my background, I really just have a very faint outline of some green leaves without giving them much definition, just a few layers of color to kind of bring out those shapes of each leaf, and nothing more than that. I didn't add a lot of veins for those leaves. I just kept them sort of very basic in the background, because what I want to avoid is adding too much detail there, so that the viewer's eye is not paying too much attention to those background layers and comes back to our flower at the front. Now in the final stage of my painting, I came back to my canvas, and essentially I just looked at the overall composition and tried to add a few details here and there. I was rotating my paper block. This is Arches, 140 pounds cold pressed, and you can see it's sort of starting to warp because I've added so many details and so many washes of color, but I was almost done, so I just added a couple of details here and there just to add some consistency. And what I really liked, and the last sort of thought that I'm gonna leave with you, is that you can see the background elements in the middle. Those greens and blues are a lot warmer, and again, this is to help the viewer kind of focus in the center of the composition and not pay too much attention to the background. So what I'm doing here is just cleaning some things up, adding a little bit of detail, but overall I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And I can see sort of my source of light is pretty much illuminating the center and the top of my composition, and I'm pretty happy about that. That's what I've been planning from the start, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you found this valuable, do subscribe and leave a like on the video. I will see you guys next week with a brand new tutorial, and have a wonderful, colorful week. Have a wonderful holiday season, and my best wishes for a happy and healthy new year.